is made queer, no need to fear. Be tuned, your mind expands today. Summa made simple, learn in a fun way.
Welcome to another episode of Summa Made Simple. In this episode, we shall be looking at the virtue of magnificence, which falls under fortitude, the cardinal virtue of fortitude. What is magnificence? Usually when we use the word magnificent in common speech, we probably don't use it with respect to the sense that St. Thomas is using it in the Summa Theologica, or even just, the classical tradition of how virtues are named. But magnificence has to do with the virtue by which we undertake great expenses in order to do something that's big, that's massive, that is great. So the typical thing where you want to do something that's really important, something that's really useful to a lot of people. And then as you start out, you start to realize, oh my goodness, this is going to be really expensive. This is going to imply a lot of money spent. And okay, I'm not going to give up. I'm going to find the ways to pull this off, whether it's selling off my own property or fundraising from other people, but we will not give up. We're going to get this done no matter what. That's the virtue of magnificence. And the reason why this should matter, why this is important to everyone, is not just because, if you're a millionaire or a billionaire, you've got enough money, you've got a lot of money that you can spend on such undertakings, then you qualify. And if you don't, then you're sort of like exempt from this virtue. What's really interesting, or what really stood out for me in the 4 articles in which St. Thomas discusses this virtue, is a little gem that he drops in the middle of the 3rd article, rather at the end of the 3rd article, in his reply to the 4th objection, in which he alludes to an idea which has been, at least for me, it's been developing little by little as I've been going through these different articles and recording these different podcasts, which is that virtue is a very internal thing. It's not an external thing, it's an internal thing. And this is a point which St. Thomas actually discusses when he's speaking about magnificence. Do I have to be rich and powerful and have a lot of resources if I'm going to, undertake something that's huge and serious? And before that, he had mentioned that the most magnificent actions that a human being can perform are those which have to do with the worship of God. And this he speaks about at the end of the reply to objection 3 of the 2nd article. And what he says is, the intention of magnificence is the production of a great work. Now, works done by men are directed to an end, and no end of human works is so great as the honor of God. Wherefore, magnificence does a great work, especially in reference to the divine honor. In other words, the most magnificent works are those which have to do with the divine honor. If you ever have the chance to go to Rome or to Prague or most European cities, at least the impression I got was that mankind has dropped in terms of magnificence, because I'd go to like the old churches in Rome or Prague, and then you look at those churches and you're like, whoa, your jaw drops, right? You're like, look at this is beautiful. This is really beautiful. And I came away feeling a bit sad, because at least I got the sense that even if people were still willing to spend that much money on building a church, just the craftsmanship is gone. I don't know if there are any craftsmen left who can build a church like this anymore. I don't know. But the point was that magnificence is mainly directed towards the divine honor. Now, does that mean if let's say I want to build a huge cathedral to honor God, I have to be a trillionaire or a billionaire? Here's the point, and this is why this whole discussion around magnificence is really important. In his reply to the 4th objection, alluding to this idea that the virtues are a very internal thing, it's something that's in our heart, so to speak, not in our actions, but in our heart. This is what he says in reply to objection 4. The chief act of virtue is the inward choice, and a virtue may have this inward choice without outward fortune. Every time he uses the word fortune, he's speaking about wealth or money. So that even a poor man may be magnificent. Let's read that again. The chief act of virtue is the inward choice, and a virtue may have this without outward fortune, so that even a poor man may be magnificent. Why can a poor man be magnificent? Why can a poor man have this inner disposition towards spending great amounts of money for great action? And the greatest act of all has to do with the worship of God? Because the chief act of virtue is an inward choice. So that means when we make choices inside of us, even though they are not translated into external acts, it is still an action, but it is an internal action, an inner action, an inward choice. But goods of fortune are requisite as instruments to the external acts of virtue. And in this way, a poor man cannot accomplish the outward act of magnificence in things that are great simply. Whenever he says simply, he means things, without relating it to other things, just by itself. So when an action is great, not related to something else, but just in itself, it's great, not compared to something else. That's what he means when he says great simply. But we can stop there. The point has been made. And this is what really stood out for me. In a sense, this confirms something that he's been alluding to and sort of repeating little by little in all the previous articles, that when you make a choice internally, that is actually an action. So you've got internal actions and you've got external actions. And virtue has a lot to do, if not entirely to do, with internal actions. And this is why it matters. And this is actually, for me, this is like good news. This is like gospel. This is like the good news. What do I mean by that? You see, maybe I don't have a lot of money. I cannot build a huge church. But if I have that inner disposition to do so, then I possess the virtues. Now, this just, it paints in an entire new light the whole idea of, so within the Catholic Church, when a person is going to be proclaimed, is in the process of being proclaimed a saint, the first step is being proclaimed a saint, being proclaimed to be in heaven. The last step is a miracle has to be attributed to them. But the first step is they have to prove that this person lived all the virtues to a heroic degree. Now, there are a lot of virtues out there. Now, you could ask us, there have been some saints who've been canonized and they spent their entire life in a bed, sick. I mean, this person didn't go around feeding the poor or feeding the hungry and clothing the naked. They didn't do any of those things. They were in bed sick the whole time, all their life. And yet, they were declared to have lived all the virtues to a heroic degree. What does this mean? It comes down to understand this, we have to understand that we have so far and most of the times misunderstood what virtue is. Many times people have defined virtue as a habit, a good habit. The problem with the word habit is that you say, okay, let's think of a habit like smoking. If you say a person has a habit of smoking, this person does not, no human being smokes 24/7. I mean, no one smokes while they're sleeping, right? You have to at least at some stage, and even if you're a chain smoker, I mean, that moment when they're lighting up a cigarette, they are not technically smoking until they've inhaled. No one can smoke all day, non-stop. Habits have this connotation of something that you do readily and easily, but on and off, on and off. You do it, then you don't do it. Then you do it, then you don't do it. Say I have a habit of going to the gym. I have a habit of exercising. I don't exercise 24/7 or all my waking hours. I mean, at some stage I have to like go to the office or do some chores at home, whatever, but I'm not at the gym all the time. This is a problem with the word habit as applied to virtue. And I would argue it's actually a mistranslation of the words that was used by the medieval philosophers when they said it's, the word that uses habitus in Latin, habitus, and then that's translated to habit, but it's one of those things whose full sense is lost in translation. A far better definition of virtue is an internal stable disposition to do the good. Internal stable disposition to do the good. Now, whether you do the good or not doesn't matter. What matters is that you have the internal stable disposition. Think of the word disposition as sort of default setting. It's like the sun. The disposition of the sun is to shine. The sun shines all the time. or like fire. The disposition of fire, fire is not fire if it's not burning, if it's not emitting heat and light. Virtue is closer to the sun or to fire than it is to habit. You cannot say that this fire has a habit of burning. No, the very definition of fire is that thing which burns and emits light and heat. Same thing with a star. It, by definition, if it ceases to emit light and heat radiation, it ceases to be a star. It's no longer a star, it's something else. It's the same thing with virtue. So virtue is like a default setting that is always turned on. It's always active internally. It's an internal choice. Now, whether it translates to an external action or not is neither here nor there, because it depends on circumstances. So a poor man may have the virtue of magnificence even though he lacks the external fortune, the external wealth or money to be able to pull off these great deeds. He's got the internal disposition. What does this mean? This means that every single human being has the ability to practice all the virtues. And more importantly, it also means, or it also implies that insofar as the virtues perfect us and make us more human, the people who practice or who have this inner disposition to practice the virtues to a greater extent are more human than those who do not. In other words, what makes us human is something that's inside of us. It's an internal choice, an internal disposition to the good. And this is actually our default setting. This is why the first law of morality, which even if Mowgli, from the Jungle Book, you picked up a kid in a jungle who grew up by himself, a feral child raised by wolves, and you taught him how to speak and you could communicate to him in some way, you'd realize that at some stage when this kid can reason, finally, even though he's feral, even though he's wild, he'll know that it's not good to climb up a tree, find a swallow's nest or a bird's nest, pick out the eggs and throw them to the ground just for the fun of it. Why? Because inside of him, his default setting is do good and avoid evil. Do good and avoid evil. And he knows that if he goes and takes those eggs from a nest, he better be, it's for the sake of eating them, nutrition, something for him to stay alive, not just to like throw them on the ground and just laugh and be naughty and enjoy himself. Do good, avoid evil. This is the first and fundamental principle of the moral law that is hard-coded into every human being. Every human being has this default setting that makes them human to do good and avoid evil. It's an internal disposition. It's like the sun shining or a fire burning. And the moment when we step away from that, we become less human. The moment we step more into that, we become more human. This is the good news of the virtues, that the virtues, the more we know them, the more we understand them, the more we practice them internally. Now, what does practicing them internally mean? This has a lot to do with something which we discussed a few episodes ago when we were discussing about how all the virtues are formally related, meaning that if I have one virtue, I have all the virtues. Again, good news. If I practice one virtue, let's say I learn to practice the virtue of patience. We'll get to it in future episodes. I learn to practice the virtue of patience. That means by practicing patience, I'm already practicing magnificence and all the other virtues, because all of them are connected formally in terms of their shape, which is a disposition to do good. So this is good news and bad news. Good news is all of us can become more human by practicing virtues, and all of us have the default setting it needs that we need to get to heaven, to become saints, to become fully human. The most human people are the saints. But it's also kind of bad news because now it means, I don't have an excuse anymore, because every time I practice vice, I'm going against my own default settings. But more on that later. That's all for this episode.